Hello and welcome to IndyTalks, the monthly interview show brought to you by the Hudson Independent, the most trusted source of local news in the river towns. I'm Barrett Seaman. My guest today, I have two of them, Constance Kehoe and Erik Weiselberg. Connie is a trustee and the deputy mayor of the village of Irvington. And she is known there in particular for her work in preserving the village's history, including winning recognition by the state of Irvington as an historically significant place. Erik Weiselberg has a PhD in history and teaches history and social studies at Irvington High School. He was recently recognized by the local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution for excellence in teaching history. Congratulations to you, Erik, on that. Revolutionary Westchester 250, or RW 250 in shorthand, refers to the 250th anniversary of the American independence, July 4th, 1776, which, if I have the math right, would take us to the year 2026. But this project has been going on since 2016. So Connie, tell us how this started and briefly what you've been up to for the past 4 years. Later on, we can get to, if we have time, we can get to what we're going to do between now and 2026.
Right. We'll do the past, getting to this point. Well, thank you for having us. The Hudson Independent has been a great friend of RW250. I got hooked on the American Revolution, believe it or not, by Main Street in Irvington. There's a Veterans Memorial there. And there was a empty granite block for which was to go the veterans that came before World War I that never gotten any recognition. I had thought we should do that. All of a sudden, the construction people say, we need to inscribe this. And I said, I don't know what names should go there. There were people from this local area that fought off the British ships coming up the Hudson, which I see right behind you. And I thought, we better get on the ball. So I thought, Erik, high school teacher, knows this stuff. And I said, Erik, can you find out who fought here in the Revolution? And I said, and there's a little time pressure because the construction people want to make this granite block something other than empty. So that was my beginning of my passion. And I then realized that, as you mentioned, in 2016, President Obama created through a national law, signed it into the legislation in Washington, that the United States should recognize and commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And I said, so much happened in Westchester. I don't know all the details, but I bet we're going to get left out to Boston, Philadelphia, Yorktown, Virginia, if we don't really get cracking and find out, get people excited. So I said to Erik again, Erik, how would you like to be the historian for this? And he said, sure. So we just started doing presentations, free presentations in libraries, topics related to Mount Kisco and the French. We did that in Mount Kisco, and Edgar's Lane was in, there was a little skirmish battle in Hastings. So we did that with the Hastings Historical Society, and 100 people would come. And
so you've been hopscotching all over the county. How many of these talks have you given just in the past 4 years?
So in those years, oh my gosh, I'd have to add, let's see, it might be 15 of them. And we did 2 full-day events too, one in Yonkers and one in Rye with reenactors. And we even had we've had George Washington, we've had horses, we've had all kinds of exciting things. So we had a trolley, we had a historic trolley ride too. So then came the pandemic and we had to kind of slow down, but we have found so much local interest that we know that as the federal project gets going, which it is, And I was just speaking today with Senator Shelley Mayer, who has agreed to be the sponsor in New York State Senate. So there will be a bill which will move through the Assembly and the Senate. You might even hear about it in January. We're moving along. So that was kind of the inspiration, and we've got new ways of operating now, which we'll get to later.
All along, you've been highlighting people from Westchester and places in Westchester that played a significant role in the American Revolutionary. Some of these, like the capture of Major Andre in Tarrytown or the Battle of White Plains, are fairly well known, but there are other less well-known people who played a role, one of whom was John Odell from right there in Irvington, where you both are. Erik, can you tell us a little bit about John Odell and the role he played and why it's important?
Sure. And I think it speaks to some of the larger issues. So, right, there's a natural question here, which is, well, why Westchester County? I mean, what about Boston, Philadelphia, some other place? Many people don't think of Westchester associated with the Revolution, or even New York City area. So to get to John Odell, we have to get to that. So, right, the British were in Boston. They can't really take over there, Lexington and Concord and all that. They come to New York because of the harbor. They settle in there. The whole war, pretty much, General George Washington is trying to get back into New York City to dislodge the British, because that's where the British are. He can't really do it, though, because his army is relatively small and untrained. So from, as you mentioned, the Battle of White Plains, that's part of the invasion of New York. The British move in. Battle of White Plains is the culmination. It's literally, if you sort of look at a map, it's the high point, right? They come up to the north right there, and Washington says, we can't do this. Let's get out of here. They cross Kings Ferry on the Hudson, and then they go over towards Trenton when they have that. And basically the rest of the war is he's biding his time till he can come back and go against the British. So it's the strategic center. It's the northern approach to the city. And the next point, as you see, is, well, the stories of people like John Odell. Looking at the memorial, I thought, let me find the names. And then I thought, but the stories are so interesting too. And as we'll see, and as you've seen in the Hudson Independent, it's not just the stories of the soldiers. Because the war came here, so many people, whether free and enslaved persons of African ancestry or free white males, either way, a war came to them they didn't want to be part of. And it created new challenges and new opportunities. So I got interested in their stories, again, including not just the soldiers. Okay, so let's talk about John Odell. So John Odell, right? His family is half English, half Dutch. They moved to this area around 1774. Good timing, right? They take up residence in a structure someone else had built earlier, Jan Harms, and someone had expanded. And here comes the British ships up the Hudson River. And so the militia, the local groups around, are saying, what are these ships doing here? The British thought they would come up and just like get the loyalists, and the people would come out and say, thank you so much for coming. We heard there's some rebels around. We love the British. But it wasn't like that. The men formed along the riverside and said, go away. We don't want these British ships here. We're feeling threatened. So right there in Tarrytown, they have a mustering ground and say, who wants to volunteer? 19-year-old John Odell is the first to volunteer, along with two Requas who lived at the area that's now Lyndhurst. That's how his story started. I'll let you ask a couple more questions and we'll see if you want. We'd be here all day with John. At Briarcliff, when I gave this lecture, I was going on, and I'm like, and another thing, and another, and I only just got started. And a woman in the front row says, excuse me. I said, yes, you have a question? Yes, yes. She says, listen, I'm 95 years old. I've been sitting too long. I got to go. So we're like, okay, we'll read about it later. Thank you so much. So anyway, I'll stop right here. And any other questions you may have about John Odell, and I'll tell you a bit about that.
Questions about him, but I would note that an essay that you wrote, Erik, we posted on the Hudson Independent website just about John Odell and the role he played as George Washington's guide.
Yes.
which was pretty significant. So George Washington didn't know Westchester for nothing, right?
Correct.
And he needed somebody like John Odell who knew the lay of the land, literally.
Yes.
So is there a significant one particular thing you can think of that John Odell did that really kind of saved George Washington's bacon during that period?
Sure. And here are the interesting things about doing local history, which is the one thing we have in evidence in the documents of about how John, like, right, you want to look for that story of like, he lashed out with his saber to protect the general. And it was, no, he told them where some fallen trees were and how far it was from Elmsford, which was then Storms Bridge, to Dobbs Ferry. So you look at it that way, like, that was pretty much not exciting.
That's
but when we fill in the pieces, right? So here's how it goes. Washington comes back to New York City. See why I had to tell you that story before? In 1781, with the French, they're right above New York, and they have to see, can we dislodge the British now? But as you say, he doesn't quite know his way around George Washington, so we need some local guides. John Odell, one of many, and they lead them on an expedition called the Grand Reconnaissance. Some of the guides were assigned to the French. John Odell was assigned to General Washington and his party. So that's major. This is like the event Washington's been looking forward to the entire war. Odell helps him find those places. Unfortunately, the British are pretty well entrenched, and George Washington decides this would be a little too costly. Then Washington gets the news that the French fleet, instead of coming to New York Harbor, is only going to go to the Chesapeake. So the combined generals make the decision, that's it, we're not going to take New York. Let's go back again to King's Ferry and go all the way down. So if you looked at it that way, well, John Odell told them where some fallen trees were. But when you look in terms of the only single record, but when you look at the big picture, that was the decision that won the war. It was the entire purpose and goal of Washington's strategy, and it depended on local knowledge of Westchester County, decision that won the war.
You mentioned King's Ferry, a Revolutionary Western 250 has I believe, a documentary or a film, a video coming out soon talking about the role that King's Ferry, Verplank, played in this thing. So, Connie, you've been a great proponent, I think, all along of making people understand the importance of place in Westchester and actually getting them to go there. So tell us a little bit about King's Ferry and what this video is going to show, and then what people can do to kind of get engaged in that themselves.
This is such a key to the stories that we're telling. RW250 with the pandemic could no longer really have all these in-person wonderful history enthusiasts get together. So I was depressed for a few months, and then I said, videos. We will make videos. So 3 minutes. In 3 minutes, RW250, with Erik's accurate history, with my kind of prodding along, and with a talented guy who could take some of our images and the old maps, was able to make a 3-minute video. It's on the YouTube public channel right now. You can search by Verplank's Point, American Revolution, you'll find it. And you can find out in 3 minutes why that strategic place, which is in Westchester, in the town of Cortland. So you've got to go north of where you are sitting right there and go up a ways. And you can see at the end of the video how to find that place, how to stand there, and how to imagine the several times when Washington crossed there. Most amazing to me is with the whole French army, all the oxen, all the artillery, all the horses. 6 days it took them, and they went across to Stony Point and then down to Yorktown. And I think, again, without Washington knowing that strategic spot in Westchester, how are we going to win the war? So place is important. Going there, I think, makes it come alive for families.
Yeah, incidentally, the Hudson Independent will be posting that video on our website, so that's one place you can go.
Right, and there are 4 more right behind it.
Good. And who are some of the other less recognized players in the revolution locally? John Jacob Peterson is the name that I picked up. Chief Nimham and Molly Sneeden of Sneeden's Landing, right?
Yeah.
Erik, can you talk a little bit about one or all of those people briefly?
Briefly, no, but I'll try. Right. So and this is also one of our, again, it happened with the monument, the memorial, was, well, what about the sort of unsung heroes? So one example would be John Jack Peterson, who was involved in the capture of Major John Andre. Again, we often hear about the 3 militiamen, and actually, honestly, I don't think we hear enough about that these days. So that's our mission too. But we know to some degree about the 3 militiamen. But part of why Andre came down Bedford Road and then into Tarrytown on his way to New York City with the plans to West Point that he got from the trader Benedict Arnold, part of the reason Andre was there alone on land is because John Jack Peterson. So John Jack Peterson was described in the records of the time as colored or mulatto. He was born in New Jersey. We don't know. Was he free? Was he enslaved? It's unclear exactly what his status was. But he seems to have been with the Sherwood family who lived in the area around Ossining. Because when one of the Sherwood sons signed up for the Continental Army, John Jack Peterson essentially said, could I go with him? So the idea that he had to ask suggests some kind of servitude of some kind. And again, his motivations, we don't know either. Was it better than whatever he had to do on the homestead? Did he have patriotic leanings? Did he just like hanging around with the young Sherwood? It's hard to say. In any case, he served in the Continental Army, several important places, including, I believe, Saratoga, Valley Forge, places like that. But when he's done with his service in 1780s, back home essentially along the Hudson River, and he's now in the militia. And he's serving alongside a different Sherwood, Moses Sherwood, cousin of the other one. And they're sort of hanging out, collecting apples and at the sort of orchard on Teller's Point, which is now Croton Point Park. And while they're hanging out there, this gunboat full of the British come in, and so they feel threatened. John Jack Peterson's very good at his shot. He shoots, kills somebody, falls off the boat. Moses Sherwood takes another shot. The landing party then returns. Then they inform the commander, Colonel Livingston, up at, again, we're back at that King's Ferry, Verplank's Point. There was a fort there called Fort Lafayette. Anyway, Livingston sends a cannon back. The cannon fires at the Vulture, because that's where that landing party came from. So the Vulture is in the river. Andre is meeting with Arnold. The Vulture gets fired on by the cannon. The Vulture disappears down the river. Now Andre's stranded. So what's Andre going to do? He goes back across King's Ferry. You see the importance of the river. And he's alone. Eventually his guide sort of leaves him for reasons we still don't know why. He's alone without his British uniform, with papers in his pocket, all 3 things his boss told him not to do. Sir Henry Clinton said, don't go alone through no man's land. Well, don't go through no man's land. He did. He said, don't have anything on you, memorize it all. Well, he had it on him. And always wear your officer coat, because then you'd be considered a prisoner and we could exchange you. Whereas if you don't have your officer's coat on, well, then you'd be considered a spy. And the penalty for spying is hanging. So he violated all 3. He's on the way to Tarrytown. And so the things that kicked off that have to do with John Jack Peterson.
Right. The Vulture left and he had to go through our own no man's land. And would the Vulture have left if John Jack Peterson hadn't taken that first shot? Who knows? Okay. So very unsung hero. And it took Erik really digging into records to get these stories.
Tell me a little bit about Chief Nimham.
Oh, wow. That's a good story.
Chief Nimham is a member. So for the most part, Native Americans sided with the British because the Native Americans are saying to the British, hey, these colonists keep taking our land. However, there were some Native American groups that sided with the Patriot cause. One of the reasons, and one of them was Chief Daniel Nimham and his son Abraham Nimham. They were a loose collection of various tribes from the Wappingers, Mohicans, and other versions of Lenape Indians. And they were opposed to the British because several years, essentially what today is Putnam County, was the land of Daniel Nimham and his people. And all these legal things happened where the whites moved in and he said, you don't have a right to do it. Nimham literally went to England and said, well, then I'm going to talk to the king. The king didn't really listen to him, brushed him off. And so when he came back, he said, well, I'm not going to work for the king now, I'm going to work for the Patriots. So in 1778, when Washington and his troops, after the Battle of Monmouth, come back into Westchester, that's right, you guessed it, across Kings Ferry, they come back and set up camp at White Plains, again, to try and dislodge the British. When Washington does that, by now he's realized Westchester's not the place for open field battles. We need what's called a light corps, light infantry, light cavalry. And as part of that, he said, how about we use the Indian style of fighting? And the Indian company under Nimham, they said, we'll form a company, but we want to be our own company. So they're part of the partisan war. They called it petite guerre at the time, because French was the language today, of warfare. Today we call it guerrilla war. And the Indian company was one of those companies. And the British partisan companies, there may be some racism here. They felt threatened that the Indian company had been successful. So they were angry. They set a trap or an ambush, and they had a battle in what's today the Bronx. It's called the Indian Field. And there was a battle, the Battle of Cortlandt Ridge or the Battle of Kingsbridge. But after the battle, it wasn't, okay, we won, now we split. That's actually how they used to fight back then. The British basically chased down the Indians and massacred them. So that is unfortunately the sad story, at least the sad ending. But again, the interesting part about all the different peoples involved, and when we say the revolution was a struggle for freedom, we always want to ask, well, whose freedom, when, and how, and where? It's very complicated. It was a struggle for freedom for those Native American Indians as well, but it meant some different things than to, well, different people.
Right. You talked a lot about Kings Ferry. There's also Dobbs Ferry, which is Sneeden's Landing. And Molly Sneeden's name came up, and I wondered, and Connie, you want to take up this one? You know enough?
It's the year of the woman. It's the 19th Amendment, and Molly Sneeden was an entrepreneur way back. So if I make a mistake, Erik will give me a D-, but I think I got it pretty well. Molly Sneeden is going to be one of our new videos, and she officially was a loyalist, but she was running the business that was taking people back and forth across the Hudson at Dobbs Ferry. Mm-hmm. And she took everybody. She took anybody or any, you know, you were on the British side, she took you, or if you were a patriot, right, she took you also.
She was in it with money.
So it was, yeah, it was a business. And it shows you a lot about how a lot of people in this no man's land really didn't have strong feelings either way. And that's an interesting parallel to warfare in many places. Syria, I mean, warfare is horrible for families, for everybody, for business. So eventually her son was a pretty active patriot. But she herself was a successful businesswoman who I think actually took George Washington's wife across the river. Erik says yes. Okay, good. That's it. A+. All right. Thanks, Erik. So I'm fascinated by these people. You can't go to Dobbs Ferry Park now without thinking, if anybody is watching this, goes to their beautiful waterfront park and doesn't go down and see the panels and look across the river and think of that entrepreneurial woman back in the 1770s, I'll be surprised.
Tell me this, Connie. I know you speak well of Molly Sneeden, but I've heard a rumor that the house she had up on Sneeden's Landing was also run as a brothel. Is there any truth to that?
We like to we like to see the complexity of all people, and there's history, and there's legend, and there's what we know and what we don't know. But as a detective and an objective outside researcher, I'm going to not answer that question.
Perhaps you'd like to answer that question or not.
Well, I would like to, but I have to. I actually hadn't come across that in the sources. I mean, it's bad enough she was a loyalist. And actually, her son, Patriot John, there, again, history's complex. We want to be careful to say, like, good guy, bad guy, or she was good or she was bad. As Connie said, Molly Dobbs Sneeden, even before the war, she was helping her family see it through. She was an entrepreneur in a time when those opportunities weren't available. And during the war, again, some people might say, oh, yeah, well, she was a loyalist, and they just pretended that Patriot John was a patriot to keep the business. Possibly. Maybe John really was a patriot. But either way, the family made it through. They survived. They were very resourceful. And like the Sneeden family and Dobbs family moved back after the war and were still a presence for many years. So again, it's complex, but we can admire the difficult situation and the heroism and the tough choices people had to make.
Right. Okay, so tell us what's ahead. You've talked a little bit about the videos you've got coming out. We've got the Kingsbury Plank one.
That one you can see right now.
One coming down the line.
Yeah.
How many do you expect to produce?
Well, there are 4 just ready, except they'll be in the next month. And then I just learned today we were funded by the Greenway, the National Heritage Area, to make whatever we can make out of $5,000. So we will make more, and that's going to be Molly, and that's going to be John Peterson, and a few others. So and we also haven't done the Battle of White Plains. But we are still going to have Erik on the stage, only it's going to be the virtual stage, because the stories that happened in Terrytown are fascinating. Not just the Andre story, there's more. And I want everybody in this local area who up and down the Hudson to be sure to register for that November 15th virtual presentation. It's the library in Terrytown, the DAR group, and the Historical Society all have signed on to say everybody should watch this. Right. So that's our next one coming up.
That'll be a Zoom or a YouTube presentation.
Yes, that'll be set up by the library, the Warner Library, and it'll be a virtual presentation, free as all of our things are. Free and open to the public, and you think you'll probably sneak in something about the John Peterson story in there, I think, but stay tuned.
Okay, so here it is, 2020. You've got 6 years to go. How are you going to fill out those 6 years? And at the end of this all, what are we going to see?
Wow. Well, if the money flows in, how would you like to see the Battle of White Plains reenacted with thousands of people in Ward Pond Reservation? That's one thing. I'd love to see that happen. That's an expensive, hard to organize event. Forums with the top historians. How about John Meacham? I'd love to get him here to talk about our local place.
So I just want to thank you both for coming on. This is a very exciting project. You're going to be busy beavers, as you have been so far. So thank you for coming on IndyTalks, and good luck.
Thank you very much. We love the Hudson Independent.